Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. Prayers and peace upon all of our prophets and upon the Prophet Muhammad. First of all, I want to say that it's an honor to be back here in Glasgow. I was telling some people earlier, and some of you know this, that most of my ancestors are actually from Scotland. In fact, my direct grandparents are Chisholm and Cummings. So I've got quite a bit of Scottish blood flowing in my veins. And I am proud of that, because I think this is an extraordinary nation. And originally I actually wanted to talk about what Islam gave the Scots and what the Scots gave the world. But perhaps I'll come back to do that, because that would have been delivered with a slide presentation. Instead, I'm going to talk ostensibly about how we view the world. And I think the title is problematic because in reality, in some ways, I can only talk about how I view the world. And I think it would be presumptuous of me to speak on behalf of all Muslims, because I certainly can't do that. There are many Muslims that actually disagree with me who know me, and there are certainly many, many other Muslims, and that's the vast majority, who've never even heard of me. So I will attempt to talk about how we see the world, and I would like to include in that we the Abrahamic faith. Because I think what a lot of people are very unaware of is that the Muslims, their general view of the world has never been seen as something dissimilar or unlike the view of the Abrahamic faith. Now, Muslims actually see themselves as children of Abraham, spiritual children, and the Arabs themselves see their actual genealogy as material children also. In fact, Arabs traditionally have called the Jewish people their cousins, which makes obviously the contentiousness between the Jews and the Arabs even more troublesome or troubling. So what I would like to begin is to talk really about the relationship between these Abrahamic faiths in the most important aspect of our lives, and that is our purpose. Because I would really argue that in many ways the modern world is a project without purpose. That the project of the modern world has never really been defined. And that is certainly not true of past civilizations. Past civilizations were deeply aware of the overarching project to which they, as constituent members of that civilization or of that tribe or group, were working. So if you look at the world face of Abraham, Christianity in particular, which is a very large faith and encompasses many millions of people, and then the Jewish tradition, which in a sense is the grandfather or the first manifestation of the Abrahamic faith, although the Quran would argue that Abraham himself was neither Jewish nor Christian, and that certainly is historically correct, but rather he was a Hanif, or somebody upright and inclined towards true religion, which, according to Muslims, is the primordial religion of man, the first religion. It's the aboriginal religion. It's the religion of the most ancient human beings on the planet, which is in a sense a certain harmony with the world, a type of a recognition that not only are we part of the world, but we have a responsibility in being part of the world. And that responsibility is in attempting to live in accordance with what in this culture was traditionally known as natural law. And the ancients were much more aware of that aspect of the world. Now, if you look at the symbol of Judaism, which is a later symbol, but it also articulates something important about the Jewish understanding of the world. The symbol of Judaism, which was in fact a common symbol of the Muslims, and you will find it in many, many mosques, and the Muslims were actually using it before it was adopted as a symbol of Judaism, which is known as the Star of David. The Star of David has two triangles, one inverted, And this represents the meeting place of the terrestrial and the celestial, of the otherworldly and the worldly, of heaven and earth. Now we can also find that symbol within Christianity, because the cross itself also symbolizes that, irrespective of what Muslims might think about the cross and its relationship to historicity or simply a symbol that was adopted later. The symbol stands, nonetheless, as a symbol of Christianity. The symbol also represents this idea of a horizontal and a vertical plane. The horizontal plane being the earthly plane, and the vertical plane being the heavenly. And these two meet. There's a meeting place between them. And that meeting place is man, is the human being. Now, if you look at Islam, that very same symbolism exists in the Shahada itself. Because the Shahada, which is the testimony that the Muslims must articulate in order to be considered Muslims, although there is an opinion in the Hanafi madhab, which is a school of legal tradition in Islam, that actually says that it's not necessary to articulate it. Any outward indication of an acceptance of Islam should be considered a testimony, in essence. So anybody that prayed with the Muslims would be considered a Muslim. In fact, even if they simply said, peace be upon the Prophet Muhammad, that would also be considered enough. And Ibn Rifa'ah from the Shafi'i school, which is another legal school, actually said that the majority of people should be considered not legal Muslims, but Muslims in substance, because he said unless there's some indication that they have rejected Islam, the assumption should be that they are Muslim, because Islam is the primordial faith. And I think that's a very interesting, because that's a very early Shafi'i position, and that is in the text, which I think adds a nuance to this idea of dividing the world into kuffar and into Muslims, which has been the traditional approach of many, many Muslims, dividing the world simply into believers and unbelievers, which is never that simple. So if you look at the Shahada itself, it represents this meeting place between the heaven and the earth. La ilaha illallah, there is nothing worthy of worship except God, and Muhammad is his messenger. In other words, a message is coming from heaven to earth, and the Prophet Muhammad symbolizes that meeting place in the same way that Christ symbolizes that meeting place in Christianity, and Moses symbolizes that meeting place in Judaism. Now, what is significant about that is that this understanding of the human being is the most dominant, widespread understanding throughout the planet. Human beings have always believed that the human being itself was an interspace between something that was immaterial and between the material. What we call the soul and what we call the body. What we call matter and what we call spirit. Now, one of the hallmarks of modern society is this removal of that aspect of the human being. And this is it's been a very difficult going. But if you look at the way the human being is being degraded in modern society, all over the world, but in modern society, which unfortunately is most pronounced in Western civilization, if you look at the way the human being is presented, the human being is being presented as the sum total of his desires, or her desires. And advertising, which influences us in ways that we're not even aware of, is constantly pulling on these strings within the human soul, inclining them towards their appetites. So we see advertisements now. If you go, I went recently into a store in California, and there were pictures of women with clothes on, and all it said was want. Just the word want. And then other ones said need. I mean, this was just the message. There was no other message. Want. Need. There's a whole advertising campaign in America for a certain soda pop that just says, obey your thirst. Now, historically, when people obeyed their thirst, they drank water. It's actually quite good for you. But now the message is obey your thirst by spending money on sugar and water, which is going to rot your teeth and cause other problems as well. I never mentioned the phosphoric acid that's in soda pop. So this, in essence, is what the modern world is telling people. It's telling people to succumb to your desires. If you go into Las Vegas in America, which represents the most decadent aspects of American society, there is literally a huge sign in the, and if you ask me what was I doing in Las Vegas, I was actually visiting a mosque there. So there are Muslims in Las Vegas. I wasn't gambling. And I'm proud to say that I don't gamble. I don't beat my wife either. So I'm trying to be good. There was a sign over the airport that said, submit to your desires. Now that, in essence, is the opposite of the message of Islam. What the message of Islam is saying is submit to your Lord who created your desires. And then utilize those desires within the parameters that your Lord has deemed right for you. Now this can be done through prophetic tradition directly, but elements of it can actually be arrived at just through intelligence. And this is what's called the fitrah of people, which is why Aboriginal people, you will not see overweight Aborigines that are living in their traditional Aboriginal societies. Obesity is not a problem amongst Aboriginal peoples. Why is that the case? Because they eat until they're satiated. Obesity is not a problem. You don't see fat lions unless they're in zoos, because they're out of their natural environment. The same is true for any of the other appetites. That human beings have appetites, but when they're constrained within healthy boundaries, they're actually not only good for them, but they're part of the bounties of our Creator. And so this is really at the essence of the Islamic teaching, that there has to be this idea of constraint. Now, in this civilization, there was once something known as the 7 deadly sins. These were taught that people were susceptible to these mortal sins, these sins that would destroy human beings. Now, one of those sins was called sloth. Now, sloth is a very interesting sin because the original meaning of it was not laziness, but it was actually spiritual laziness. It was when people made no effort to improve their spiritual nature. It was an abandonment of the highest human project, which is to develop the soul and prepare it for the next stage of existence. Because for Abrahamic peoples, we do not believe that the soul ends with our death. We actually believe that there's a movement to another phase. And this is also consistent with the overwhelming majority of peoples on this planet who have some concept of afterlife. This is also being removed from modern society. And everything that is immediate, everything that is pleasurable in some immediate sense, is what is encouraged. Despite the fact that some of the most honored people in this culture are people that have a discipline to actually set aside immediate pleasure and work for many, many years in order to achieve some type of mastery in music, in athletics, in architecture, in languages, in whatever. But those people are actually honored. So people that have self-discipline in the world tend to be some of the most successful and some of the most honored people. So those people that are encouraged to indulge in themselves, to lose any discipline, to capitulate to their own desires, are usually the failures of society. And yet this is what is being presented to the vast majority of people on this planet today through mass media, I mean, this is what is being presented as your project. And the Abrahamic traditions, and certainly Islam as the culmination, the acme of those traditions, sees that this, in fact, is the worst thing for human beings to do. The Quran says, كَلَّا بَلْ تُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَةِ. You love immediate things. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ مِنْ عَجَلٍ. Man is created from this love of hastiness. And you put off what's coming, which is procrastination. The Quran warns people about this aspect. And so, this is at the essence of the Muslim view of the world. That the world is matter and spirit. That the human being is more than the sum total of his chemical and biological constituents. That we are actually people of spirit. And that it is the spirit that is actually more important than the matter itself. And that is why, in defense of the spirit, Muslims, as were Christians in the past, and certainly other traditions, are willing to sacrifice the matter for the sake of the spirit. And this is the highest act of sacrifice. Make sacred. That's what the word means in Latin. To make sacred. To take your life itself and make it sacred. To dedicate your life to the Spirit. And this is why the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that the greatest sacrifice that a man could make is to speak the truth. To speak the truth. كَلِمَةُ حَقٍّ عِنْدَ سُلْطَانٍ جَائِرٍ. To speak the truth in the presence of tyranny. That this is the highest sacrifice that a human being can make, because there's nothing higher than truth. And truth, as we know it, is articulated through language. This is the closest approximation that we can get to. La ilaha illallah, or there's nothing worthy of worship but God, is in essence an ineffable truth. It's something that we can't really say, but this is the closest approximation to that reality, and that's why we articulate it. But we recognize that we cannot know God as He is truly known, as He knows Himself. That human beings are limited. So that is the Shahada. If you move to the prayer, which is the next basis, the prayer is in order to connect people with the heavenly. And this is something that, again, it saddens me to see all of these extraordinary testimonies to the faith of the people of this land for centuries, and the abandonment of many of those testimonies. The loss of the sacred, and that people would rather fill their lives with frivolities and trivialities than fill their lives with spiritual substance, with things that are of an eternal nature, things that are of ultimate concern. Now, if you look at the prayer, most Muslims, unfortunately, associate the prayer with performance. And this is a tragedy, because the prayer is not the physical movements. The physical movements are part of the prayer. A necessary but not sufficient condition to prayer. The real prayer is something that happens inside of one's heart. And that is why there are many people that perform the prayer, but there are few people that are actually praying. Because one of the hallmarks of the prayer, according to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that the prayer, that one who consistently prays will become a virtuous human being. And the Quran itself says, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. That prayer will constrain human beings from doing wrongs. And so those people that are performing the perfunctory motions of prayer and still continue to do wrong, they're in fact not praying, they're simply performing a mechanical action that could be done by a robot. A robot could be designed and could be prayed, and they'll probably come along with that, just like they have prayer watches and all these other things, so you can just have your robot do your 5 prayers for you, because you're too busy. I mean, that is not far-fetched. You might think it is, but you'd be surprised. So that is what the prayer is. It is a connection with the celestial. It is a reorientation. And one of the interesting things, if you look at the word orientation in English, it means to know where the east is. Orient is the east. And oriented people are people that know where the sun rises. And this is because in all traditional societies, people had a good sense of the cardinal directions. So one of the things that Islam does is it orients you always to sacred place. The prayer comes in fixed times, which is sacred time. And sacred place is to be oriented towards a sacred place. If you look at the churches in Scotland, many of them are facing Jerusalem. Because that was the traditional qibla, or prayer direction, of the Christian peoples. So having a direction, a focal point in your life, which orients you to what is true and eternal, is again connecting people with the celestial. And what's interesting, in the Islamic tradition, the Kaaba is believed to be actually a celestial house, and the cube that exists in Mecca is a symbol of that celestial house that is circled by angels, which is also part of the worldview of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, that there's an angelic realm working in the world. Now, if you move to the zakat, which is charity, and one of the interesting things about charity in Islam, if you look in Judaism and in Christianity, charity is a private act. In Islam, charity is both a private act and a social act, because charity is actually collected and distributed by the state. And what that does is it actually ensures that poor people are given their due. Because, unfortunately, many people begin to hoard and withhold as their connection with the celestial is eroded. They begin to hoard wealth. And this is something of the fear within people, because, unfortunately, people are motivated by fear and desire. These are two motivational factors that are constantly working within the human being. Fear and desire. Now, the fear of poverty is one of the major fears of people. And so part of the Islamic tradition is that you relinquish that fear in your heart by trusting in a providential provider, a provider that is benevolent. And that's why the Quran says, وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا وَعَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُهَا. There's no creature in the heaven or the earth except a provision has been apportioned for it. Now, if you ask why people are starving and areas where there's people that are suffering is human neglect. Pure and simple. And the Quran says don't blame God on that, because there's a verse in the Quran where they say, should we feed people that had God wanted, He would have fed them? I mean, this is an argument that people make. No, that is actually a duty upon people that have surpluses of food to ensure that those surpluses go to people that have diminution of their supplies. And so the failure is a failure of man. And people ask, where is God? But God is asking, where are you? I mean, this is the question that the Quran asks. Where are you? I gave you everything you need, and I even put compassion and mercy in your hearts as a human mechanism, and you see these things, and yet you don't do anything about them. So the question is not, where am I? The question is, where are you? You see, because the writing's on the wall. But if you're illiterate, I mean, there's a problem. It becomes difficult to read the writing on the wall. But the writing is on the wall. So zakat, in essence, is a type of pruning. And what this does, if you prune a tree, it keeps the tree healthy. If you don't prune the tree, then the tree begins to accumulate dead weight. And this is why zakat, unlike tax, which according to Islamic tradition is actually unjust. Taxing people's income is considered unjust. And actually, traditionally in the West, it was seen as one of the most egregious crimes of states against populations. Although there is an idea of public works and providing security and safety, and so obviously people commit to that. But in Islam, the tax is actually on wealth that is stagnant, on wealth that is not in currency. I mean, isn't that interesting that we use the word currency to describe our means of exchange? Because wealth is meant to be in currency. And what happens when water stagnates? When water stagnates, it becomes poisoned. It becomes toxic. It becomes polluted. And that's why when water flows, it's healthy. Now it's interesting that the word in Arabic for miser, and by the Islamic definition, the miser is the one who withholds charity. The word in Arabic for miser is the same word for constipated. It will eventually poison you if you don't give out. And the word for pure gold and meconium stool, which is the stool of little babies in their wombs, the first stool they have is called meconium stool. The word in Arabic for pure gold and for the first stool is the same. I'm wondering if there's a cognate, because in Arabic it's iqi, which sounds like icky. I always wondered if that was actually from the Arabic. I mean, there's a lot of words that people don't realize. For instance, British people, I don't know, do you use the word bug off or you're bugging me in British English? Well, in American, you say, he bugs me. Right? Well, where does bug come from? It comes from Yemen. The word in Arabic for insect, a pest, is bug. And the Yemenis pronounce the qaf ga, so they say bug. Bug is a pest. It's an insect that bothers you. So if you look in Chambers' Dictionary of Etymology, it will say bug, origin unknown. And the problem with a lot of people that write etymological dictionaries is that they didn't study Arabic. If you look at Noah Webster, who wrote a dictionary in 1832, Noah Webster actually said that everything was from this original language. And that's why and this was published in the United States in 1832. Noah Webster's dictionary, which is where we get Webster's dictionary. I know people here prefer Oxford's dictionary, but in America we prefer Webster's dictionary. One of the things that he does is shows how English is all related to Hebrew and Arabic. So it's a very interesting book from that perspective, because he wanted to prove that the original language of man was actually a Semitic language. So he says, like, come here is from qum ta'ala. And he actually puts the Arabic in the dictionary. So it's an interesting, curious book. But if you look at that idea of withholding what is due to others, there's an element of ingratitude that's harmful, both to yourself and to others. And it's something that will poison your soul. This is the idea. You will actually become poisoned. And wealth is seen, there's a hadith, a prophetic tradition of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he said that God has made a metaphor for what comes out of the son of Adam, meaning feces, as a symbol of the world itself. You see, this is how traditionally this was understood, and that's the low elements of the world, because the world is also something extraordinary. It's an epiphany of God. It's a manifestation, and it's the way in which we know the Spirit. And so there's something very majestic and beautiful about the world, but there's also an element in the world which is the corruptibility of the world, the evanescence of the world, the fact that the world is deteriorating before our eyes, just as we ourselves are deteriorating. So these are signs for us, if we would reflect. And then you move to the idea of fasting, and this is also to discipline our souls, because food is the primordial urge within the child. I mean, the child is screaming because it doesn't have the breast. You give it the breast, and suddenly it's at ease. And so this is a very early impulse within human beings. And to discipline this aspect of the self means that other aspects of the self are easily disciplined. And then finally the Hajj. And this is a very important aspect of Islam in terms of the 5 pillars, because what the Hajj represents is the unity of being, the unity of God. And you go to this point on the planet, and what you're celebrating is not simply the unity of God, but also the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity. And this is a really important point that I'd like to stop for a few moments and look at. One of the things about pre-modern societies is that they were largely tribal. If you look here, for instance, you have the clans in this great land, Scotland. You have these clans, and the clans worked together sometimes, and other times they didn't. And you had differences that were sometimes ideological, they were sometimes political, they were sometimes religious, because when the Protestant Reformation occurred, certain clans maintained their Catholicism, and other clans converted to Protestantism, and this created conflicts. So tribalism and clanism have often been sources of immense hostility between the sons and daughters of Adam. Now, what's very interesting is if you look at Judaism, Judaism has evolved into, in essence, a tribal religion. Bani Israel, which is what they're called in the Quran, means the tribe of Israel. And traditionally, the Jews did not encourage people to convert to Judaism. In fact, the 613 Qurrat laws were seen as peculiar laws to their own tribe. In fact, the Jews consider it, to this day, Orthodox Jews, consider it easier to be a non-Jew, but you have to follow the 7 Noahidic laws, or the Noahic laws. The 7 Noahidic laws exist in both Christianity and Islam, which is why early Jewish rabbis actually believed both Christians and Muslims to be salvific paths. In other words, traditional Jewish theology, according to Moshe ben Maimon, who's known in the West as Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish theologians, said in fact that Muslims and Christians were both saved because they were following this Noahidic tradition, or the 7 Noahidic truths. And one of them was to set up courts of justice, in which justice is practiced. If you look at Christianity, Christianity introduces a new element. Now, there are verses that are somewhat paradoxical in the New Testament, because in some areas Christ says, I've only been sent for the lost tribe of Israel. In some areas he says, I haven't come to remove one iota of the Old Testament, of the Torah, of the law. And yet in other places there's an indication that he has universalized the message. And this is certainly what Paul takes as an apostle within the Christian tradition, universalizing the message of Christianity and spreading it, according to the Gospel of John, unto all nations. And so Christianity becomes a universal force and spreads throughout the globe, and that's why today there's Christians all over the world. Now, Islam, as it arose with a new doctrine also. Within the essence of the religious teaching of Islam, all of the teachings of Christianity and Judaism were actually maintained. And there was an extraordinary joining of these two traditions. So, for instance, in the Quran, it says very clearly, كَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ فِيهَا. We have decreed to the children of Israel, to the Jews, in the Torah, fiha, in the Torah, a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a nose for a nose, that there is retribution, right? Retributive justice. So this is the Old Testament. But then the Quran says, but should you, Muslims, should a Zionist journal, this is an atonement for your own sins. In other words, forgiving is a higher force. And then immediately after that, the verse says, and we followed up the Torah with Jesus, the son of Mary, bringing a new law into the world, which is the law of forgiveness. I mean, this is really at the essence of Christ's teaching. And this is why in all the tafsirs of Islam, when they mention Jesus as a messenger and apostle of God, they mention that his message was a higher message than the message of retributive justice. He was actually saying to forgive those who wrong you. Now what Islam does, which is very interesting, is it retains the truth of Judaism, but encourages the truth of Christianity, because it knows that the Christian ideal is so exalted, so rarefied, and so high, very few people will ever be able to practice it. And this will result in not justice, but revenge. Because when justice is not dealt, people tend to take justice into their own hands. And this is part of the problem on the planet right now, is that you have individuals that are beginning to take justice into their own hands. Because isn't it interesting that Sigmund Freud, said that revenge was wild justice. It was an attempt at the individual to simply get some type of retributive justice for wrongs that he perceived, either real wrongs or perceived wrongs. Because for the individual, that is a moot point. I mean, we can look and say, well, he's not really being wronged. But for the individual who feels that they're being wronged, the reality of it is their experience is wrong.
and if you do not redress that wrong, a resentment begins to build. Now Nietzsche, the German philosopher, considered resentment probably the most dangerous force acting in the world. And he called it a ticking time bomb in the heart of man. And I think that that's very interesting in relation to suicide bombers, to people willing to blow themselves up in airplanes, that resentment can fester in the human soul to such a degree that people become explosive. Their very personalities are explosive. Unless wrongs are redressed. Now this is why the sixth pillar of Islam, as some refer to it, although it is not a pillar of Islam, but some have referred to it as the sixth pillar of Islam, and this brings up jihad and the idea of struggle in the world. And I want to say that it's very important for people to recognize that jihad was never seen in the history of Islam in the light that it's being seen either on behalf of the Muslims or on behalf of the non-Muslims, ever. And I really believe that. One of the most interesting aspects of the Quran is that it addresses all humanity. And I haven't really found this specific in either the Torah or in the Gospel from God Himself, addressing all of humanity. But this is the claim of the Quran, is that it is addressing all of humanity. There are many verses that say, Ya ayyuhan nas, O humanity, O humankind. Now in 49:13, there's a very profound verse, profound in the sense of this topic, that says, we have created you, the royal we, God, we have created you, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum, we have created you min dhakarin wa untha, from a male and from a female. And from these two come this extraordinary diversity within humanity. And then it says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلًا, and we have diversified you into clans, qaba'il, and into peoples. Now, the definition of a clan, according to the commentaries of the Quran, are those people who know their common father. For instance, if you're from the McGregor, then McGregor is a common link between all of you. There's some father that is linking all of you. Quraysh, Tamim, these are names of actual individuals that live. Now, the other group of people are people that have forgotten who their common ancestor is, and these people are shu'ub. They're peoples that are united by language and by culture. Now, what is very interesting is the Quran addresses all of us as Bani Adam, that we are the children of Adam and Eve. So we are all, in essence, a tribe. Now, the Quran says, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً, and this is misunderstood by many, many Muslims. This idea that somehow Muslims are a brotherhood, but there's no brotherhood of man. And this is rejected if you look in traditional commentaries, and I'm talking about pre-modern commentaries. Always our scholars have understood that all of us are brothers and sisters in Adam and Eve. We are Banu Adam. But the immediate brotherhood is the brotherhood of the immediate family. And this, in essence, is only to highlight the idea of charity begins at home. That you should take care of your immediate family before you take care of other people's. And that is why Muslims are told to take care of Muslims in need before they extend that need to other peoples. But if there's a surplus, then, and in fact, according to Islamic tradition, even if there's not a surplus, many of our scholars say that charity can still be given to people who are outside of the faith if they're not hostile towards the faith. And these are called mu'allafat qulub, the people whose hearts are close to you. And the Quran says, Muslims will read the verses that say, وَقَاتِلُ الْمُشْرِكِينَ, fight all the polytheists and all these. They'll read these verses, but they won't read them in the context of other verses. لَا يَنْهَاكُمُ اللَّهُ عَنَ الَّذِينَ لَمْ يُقَاتِلُكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ. God does not prohibit you from those who have not persecuted you or driven you from your homes, and تَبَرُّهُمْ, that you should be righteous towards them. Show them all types of good. وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ, share your wealth with them, according to the commentators. Share your wealth with them. Help them. Work together. تَعَوْنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. work together in things that are righteous. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that in the pre-Islamic period of vengeance, because the scholars differ on what Jahiliyyah means. Some of our scholars say that the period before Islam is called Jahiliyyah because it was made of ignorance. But there are other scholars that say, no, it was called Jahiliyyah because it was an age of revenge. And revenge is a Jahili quality. It is an ignorant quality, this desire for revenge. And Islam, in fact, came to break the cycles of revenge. And this is what we're trapped in today. We're trapped in deep cycles of revenge, of oppressor oppressed. And these cycles will destroy this world. It will destroy this society if we don't take them seriously, if we don't begin to learn to live together. And these are becoming more important in the light of the fact that individuals now have the power that pre-modern armies didn't have. I mean, literally, individuals now have within their own hands the power to inflict damage that pre-modern armies did not have. So we are in a very perilous situation. And if we don't rise to the occasion, I really think that we're going to find ourselves in conditions that generations after us will curse us for not doing anything about. And I don't believe that's hyperbole. I don't believe that's exaggeration. I really believe that we are at a critical juncture. Banu Adam, the children of Adam. And Muslims need to learn to live with other peoples on this planet in the same way that other peoples need to learn to live with Muslims. And one of the greatest trials and tribulations that is affecting all of us is the gross injustices that are going on, and nothing is being done about it. And I'm talking about maldistribution of wealth. I'm talking about lands that are expropriated by people without any just cause. I believe that the Jews have every right to exist. I believe that they have a right to exist in Palestine. I believe that because that's actually part of Islamic tradition. In fact, in Islamic history, the Jews were encouraged to migrate to the lands of the Muslims. And I can show you dozens of historical references that prove that point. The Ottomans invited the Jews to migrate to the lands of Islam. Always. They've never had a problem living with Jews. But there is something in Zionism which is called the hidden question. And this question was put forth in 1907 by a Zionist intellectual, Yitzhak Epstein, who wrote an article in Hashua, which was a Zionist journal. And he said, the dilemma facing us today, this hidden question, was that we cannot reconcile Jewish sovereignty in a land that the Palestinians should be sovereign in. I don't think anybody could argue who knows the history with that point. Golda Meir denied the existence of the Palestinians. Now, much of the problem in the Muslim world is directly related to both Palestine, not just to Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, Bosnia. I mean, it's interesting that Muslims are constantly called violent, they're constantly called aggressive, belligerent, and yet if you really look out there and look at the numbers, I'm not talking about 9/11, 3,000 people killed, I'm talking about the numbers, the actual damage that's being, if you just count, when you have a war, you count the sides. Americans, 600 or 700 dead. Iraqis, we don't even know. We don't know how many Iraqis are dead. That number we're not told. But if you look at these places, I mean, in Palestine for over 50 years, there's about 30,000 people have been killed. About 7,000 of them are Jews. So looking at the numbers now, you're looking at 23,000 to 7,000. That's what's there. Now, if you look the same in places like Kashmir, and this is not to say that the Muslims don't have their crimes, and this is something that the Muslims don't like to admit. And this is part of the problem, because many Westerners and many other people, they look at the Muslims and they say you're in denial, forgetting that denial is a big river in the Muslim world. In Egypt, denial. So the Muslims do succumb to this denial of the fact that there are atrocities. I'll give you one example. In the state of Syria, there were more people probably killed in Hama by the Syrian government against Syrians than in the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, I think it's tragic that Muslims would actually hold up a picture of a man who modeled himself after Stalin. But this is unfortunately the pathetic condition that many of Muslims have fallen down to. That it's tribe, not truth. Do you see? And in the end of the day, Islam is not a tribe. And the Quran very clearly states, be with the truth even against your own tribe. That's what the Quran says. The Quran says, stand with the truth even against yourself. وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ. And that's why I think Muslims need to be brutally honest. We need to be brutally honest. And this is consistent with our worldview and with our ethics. And until we do that, it's very difficult for us to really address other people's about their honesty or lack thereof. I think Muslims really, and the more honest we are, the more palatable our grievances are going to be for other peoples. But I think it's very important. So I think a type of fairness needs to be on all sides. That we need to really be much fairer, you see. And that's why there are Jews in America that are extraordinary in their condemnation of the injustices. There are even Jews here in Great Britain. And they should be supported. And those people, I consider them brave people. And the same is true for Americans that are willing to stand up and speak the truth. Those people should be supported. And this is very important because I think another major problem with the Muslim world and also with the West is the tragedy of what is known as collective guilt. And this is a Marxist concept. It's holding all of the capitalists guilty for the sins or crimes against the proletariat. This is very alien to the Islamic tradition. The Quran says, "La taziru waziratun wizra ukhra." One soul does not bear the sins of another. One soul does not bear the sins of another. You cannot hold a people to account. And that is why to hold the Spanish people to account for the Spanish government's position on certain things is absolutely unfair and unjust. Overwhelming majority of Spanish people were completely against the war in Iraq. To take the people to account for that is absolutely unjust, and to take even the government to account for that outside of state-sanctioned positions is absolutely unacceptable in a civilized world. And Islam is a religion of civilization. And that is why Muslims traditionally have always worked within the law. They have never worked outside of the law. And we recognize what is known in Islam as al-adala al-mushtaraka, shared justice between Muslims and non-Muslims. We recognize that. I mean, if we didn't, we couldn't live together, we couldn't trade, we couldn't have commerce, we couldn't do anything. So we recognize that. So it's very important that Muslims and peoples in the West, Western Muslims, reject this concept of collective guilt. I mean, I stood out in very cold weather in London with about 1 million, mostly British people, and even people that came from Scotland, for 5 hours. And those were people, 1 out of every 60 people in the United Kingdom saying, not in our name. And I think that represented the majority of people in Great Britain. And I think that many of the people here are decent and good people, and I think the Muslims need to recognize that decency. There are elements within this society that are unfortunately very misguided, very misled, the racist element that exists within the society. But I think this society has made immense strides to overcome racism. And that is an Islamic quality. You want to see how we view the world? The Muslims view the world as a world in which races are to be honored, races are to be seen as a sign of God. The Quran says that in your colors, your complexions, and in your tongues are signs of God. So these are things that we all have to recognize here, that we have made great strides. That there are certain principles and ideals in the West today that were the dreams of philosophers centuries ago. That they have become common knowledge amongst common people. And we cannot allow a minority within these societies or a minority within other societies to destroy those qualities. To destroy those things that all of us share as ideals and principles. And I would say that Islam is absolutely congruous with the highest ideals of Western society. I really believe that. And even in the secular position, if you look at the Archbishop of Canterbury, when he spoke out against certain aspects that he felt were troublesome, he was voicing his own conscience. And that, in essence, is what the great scholars of Islam have done. The great scholars of Islam fled from government. They never wanted to be part of government. Abu Hanifa died in prison because he refused to enter into the employment of government. The Muslims always saw that government, by its nature, is the ground of government is compromise. And the ground of religion is principle. And religion is unshakable. I mean, if you want to use an alchemical model, in alchemy you have this idea of mercury and lead. And you use these two elements to transmute things. Well, mercury is a very mercurial substance. It doesn't have any, you can't hold on to it. That's the way politics is. Politics is mercurial. One day you're against the referendum, the next day you're for the referendum. And that's the nature of politics. And politicians will always do that. You know, party line. Politicians don't speak from their conscience, with rare exception. They speak party line, whether they believe it or not. Religion is the ground of principle. Religious people are principled people, and they cannot in any way compromise those principles. And that is why I really believe that historically, the closest analogy in the West that I can see of the Muslim scholar, somebody like Martin Luther King, was never part of the government, but always spoke the truth as he saw it to the government. And this was the highest ideal within the Islamic scholastic and spiritual tradition. Thank you very much, and I would just like to finish by saying that I really believe that we're either in death throes or birth pains on this planet. And I do feel that in the end of the day, God has given us choice, but we need to really take that seriously and begin to change the way that we're doing things. There's an immense amount of change needed. There's an immense amount of activity from yourselves of really getting involved. Those of you that have children, like myself, I think we see things very differently because we have a responsibility to fend off skepticism, to fend off those negative voices out there that are saying this is the world and there's nothing that can be done about it. I don't believe that, and I don't think it's fair to my children. I want to live in a better world, and I want to contribute to making the world a better place, not just for my children, but for the children of Adam. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.